So but I agree, we've seen the same kind of responses in terms of how people are managing the actual getting the work done is possible, but there's some critical moments where maybe being online is going to be difficult. Yeah. Yeah.
The biggest problem was that students could not use our workshops.
Yes.
So this year we're working without models, almost without models.
Yeah, we're looking at the same thing, or how to manage that right now. Maybe only some very small group of students can use the shop at certain times, and that's very organized. Or maybe like 3D prints. You can still do 3D prints, but they would be managed by like 1 or 2 students who actually then leave them 3D prints in a special box, so you don't actually touch the 3D printer or anything like that. I don't know.
Yeah, but
isn't there a thing, right? Modeling physical, like chipboard models or something, like 3D renderings.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think for a lot of students, it's very appropriate to like, you know, they can work by hand and just build cardboard models like I did when I was in school. But then, you know, if you have a range of different types of studios you're teaching, if you're teaching a very technical studio that's based on scripting and digital production, you know, maybe that studio needs to have access to some of the machines in order to like continue their work. So that's a lot of the work that my faculty right now is the fall is how do you
maybe we should start.
Part of the conversation. I don't know.
Yeah. We already have some listeners, viewers at Zoom, and we started our YouTube broadcasting. So let's start. My name is Alexander Ostogorsky. Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm teaching at the Moscow Architecture School March. Welcome to another meeting of the series of talks dealing with architecture education, its present state and possible futures. I can see that we have many people with English names today. That's good. But for those who would like to listen to the talk in Russian, you can use the globe icon on the control panel to switch to translation. Встреча пройдет на английском языке, но если вам нужен русский перевод, то вы можете воспользоваться значком глобуса на панели управления, чтобы переключиться на перевод. This spring and summer, architecture schools are trying to figure out how to do lectures and seminars online, how to conduct studios and breeds. But it is just as well, I think, it's a test of the very foundations of architectural education. And that's why this summer, March Architecture School invited educators from schools around the world to discuss how we think the architectural education could be changed, if it need any change. And one of those foundations of architecture education, of course, is design studio, which has a long history coming from medieval workshops through ateliers at École des Beaux-Arts, teamworks in Bauhaus and Coutumas, units in the A School of Architecture, and many other examples could be mentioned. There are all different forms of interaction between students and teachers. In the end of our previous talk, Solomon Froster and Lee Catherine Schatzka expressed their critical view of how schools are eager to jump on hot issues like pandemic or political and social troubles. But on the other hand, we cannot imagine how schools, and especially design studios where interaction is very intense, how they could restrain themselves from being reactive to what's going on in the real world outside of academia. So this is basically, as I understand, what we will discuss. But the general rule of these talks is that everyone who we invite, they're free to direct the conversation where they want to. That's how we can try to understand what is going on in architectural education and where it's going. I will introduce our guests. Troy Schaum is an architect engaged in teaching and research as an associate professor at the Rice School of Architecture. His professional practice with partner Rosalind Sheikh, I guess I'm pronouncing all the names correctly.
Very good.
Yes? Yeah?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So the professional practice Schaum was a finalist in the 2017 of MoMA PS1 Young Architects program, a winner of the in 2016 New Practices New York by the American Institute of Architects, and was named one of the 2019 Emerging Voices by the Architectural League of New York. He's also the editor of the book Totalization, Speculative Practice in Architectural Education, published by Park Books in last year. David Duэйн, Rice Architecture alumnus, and as I understand, David, you were students of Troy, right?
Absolutely right. Yep.
Yeah. David is an architect, entrepreneur, publisher, and journalist. Has a background in ecological and socially relevant design. And his current research focuses on global population dynamics, workplace design, and spaces of hyperconnectivity. Daniel Roche has a background in urban design, architecture, and journalism. He's working now for the Rethink Studio, a planning and design company that specializes in transportation. Daniel actually spent some time in Moscow because he graduated from an intense master's in advanced urban design program by Stroke Institute. Well, this is the end of my introduction. Now I'm leaving the floor. We'll be happy to get some questions somewhere in the middle of the conversation. Please address them in chat here in Zoom or in YouTube. We'll pick them up and address to our speakers. This is where I stop. Please, Troy, David, and Daniel, take the floor.
Thanks, Alexander.
Yeah, thanks, Alexander. Okay, Troy, thanks so much for having this conversation. It's great to see you again. Let's just start off by talking about totalization really quick. Could you just give like a definition, like for the people in the audience that have never heard of it before, a concise definition, if possible?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, one of the reasons I think I was invited to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation from March and Alexander to do this. It's a perfect opportunity to talk about a lot of things, including some of the work we've been doing at Rice and totalization. So totalization is a term that's been floating around in architectural education, in architectural thinking for most of the 20th century. And at Rice, there's a group of studios that I've been directing for the last 10 years that we've put together a book based on the work that Alexander mentioned called Totalization, Speculation and Architectural Practice. That looks at the question of how architectural expertise is taught in schools today. And so there's an imagination of architectural education as the kind of single authorial architect, something like an architect that sits and has an idea, and then from that idea, makes a diagram or writes a manifesto, and from that kind of imagination, then builds the project. Kind of linear genesis of an idea from a single architect to a built project. What we started to acknowledge in these studios when we thought about architectural practice and the nature of architectural expertise today is that what we see is architects that are actually engaged in many, many more complex teams or teams with greater and greater complexity. And, from acousticians to legal consultants to different kinds of consultancies that specialize in environmental issues. And architects were engaged in these larger social webs. And how could school and this teaching environment take advantage of these kind of larger webs of knowledge expertise that are at work today in practice? And so that's really at the core of totalization. And the other shift that the book makes a claim for is to take this term that's in a lot of ways a kind of problematic term that imagines a kind of a totality that's a totalness that is a boundary, that creates boundaries around things and says this is what's inside and this is what's outside. And we wanted to shift the definition of that term in architecture and think about it as something more like an accountant's spreadsheet, something that is more open-ended. If you have a spreadsheet in Excel, it can go on forever. And accountants use the term totalization as a kind of accounting, almost like a receipt that you would get at the end of a big meal to see what you did, what kinds of expertise you did employ, what kind of consultants you did engage, and that our understanding of architectural education, instead of being centrally organized, becomes something closer to a menu. And even a project, and when you think about the expertise that you need to execute a project, becomes something like negotiating that kind of menu of issues. And so that decentralization of thinking about architectural education was really important, I think, in thinking about how we built up these studios.
What do you mean, like decentralization? Like, how does the architect remove themselves from being the center? Like, there is no center?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think when we see how knowledge and how ideas move around in architecture, in the discipline and in the social circles around the discipline, we tend to think of architectural inspiration like happening like within an individual architectural author, even a single firm or a single individual. But when you start to look at how architecture is practiced, like some of the individuals in the book, practices like Heinges, which is a curtain wall consultant and does work all over the world. And Heinges in the book talks about this. You know, he works for Pelli, he works for Weissman Freddy, he works for Mineo, he works for OMA, Rex, he works for a very diverse group of individuals. And so, you know, if you want to think about, you know, what's making those projects, it's not just the architects that are making those at those different firms that are making those decisions about how the facade looks or how the enclosure works, but it's this kind of expertise that's actually working across practices. And so, you know, how do you build a model for that to educate an architect when you ask the question, what do architects need to know as they confront all the different challenges they're going to confront in the world when you're building an education? I think you need to be able to both gain a kind of store of knowledge about how you deploy your practice on your own, but you have to be open to how you engage these kinds of expertise that move laterally or, you know, or decentralized modes of knowledge across the discipline.
How does that affect the way that you think about authorship for a project, or that you try to impress upon a student, like authorship in a design project? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I understand the question. I mean, I would just zoom out a little bit. And Alexander mentioned this a bit in his intro. There's a long history of architects and people that are engaged in building, trying to think about how our practices fit into a larger framework of knowledge making. And that larger framework of knowledge making, at some points, we've been understood to be master builders, people that are engaged in the craft of cutting stone, of making wood, of assembling arches, and the knowledge was something much more like a kind of know-how. We knew how to do certain kinds of things. When I say more recently, in the past, 150 years or so, the knowledge of architects has been thought of something that's has been professionalized and thought of something much more like the kind of knowledge making that exists around the practice of like law or medicine or other kinds of like professional knowledge. And that knowledge is seen as something that's like much more based on deploying contracts. It's a different kind of managerial knowledge. And then it also centers around this idea of a kind of artistic authorship, that it's not a practice that you're embedded in like building, but it's you have an idea, that idea has kind of agency, and that idea is the thing that you're selling as a kind of sole author. And that's been kind of reinforced in how we imagine certain kinds of signature architectural works, not so much an architect engaged practice of building. And so what I think is, those are not stable categories, and those categories, I think that there's lots of work that has been done over our recent history to undermine those as stable categories. But what we see is, I think the difference in what I'm trying to get at in totalization is often, more recently, when architects are trying to explore something like how a particular wood could be fabricated by a machine, or how a new kind of assembly process could work with like bricks and robots, those things become quite specialized. And so what totalization was attempting to do was to try to step back and look at the whole product of whole process of architectural production, and try to understand how the architect's role could take on projects that might exist at larger scales.
You said you've been working on this for like 10 years, right?
We've been teaching the studios for 10 years, yeah.
So how does
that's how you could be my student, I guess.
Yeah, I know, right? How is that initial vision that you started out with 10 years ago, or like that rendition of this, how has that evolved into what is the current state, and what's the delta been like?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's really interesting to talk to this to a Russian audience as well. But in American education tends to be heavy on theory and in certain theoretical discourses, at least at the schools that I was trained in and the schools that I'm teaching at. And issues of like building science and issues of technical expertise related to building science are treated as a kind of siloed domain, or a kind of like walled off domain, typically. And those two, they're treated as very different in the curriculum, and they're treated as very, I think, different by the faculty and students that teach them. And so I was initially asked to take on the question of how we teach certain kinds of building science problems in the context of studio. And at a school that was like very driven by history and theoretical criticism as a mode of teaching. And so the initial program was meant to kind of destabilize those categories, frankly, and destabilize that kind of binary that had built up, that I tried to describe more globally, but had built up in a lot of curriculums. And so it was much more experimental when I first started, and how you make something that exists program-wide is a very big challenge for very young faculty, especially. So that's what started. It started as an idea that would basically, I can explain the mechanics of what we do. The mechanics of what we do is we actually invite people into the studios that are typically not in the studios. We invite experts that work on energy management, experts that work on acoustics, experts that work on structures, experts that work on envelope issues, that know about glass.
And these are professionals that are these other faculty, or are these professionals, or kind of a mix?
No, these are practitioners from the outside world, and we from the outside of the hedges, we say to Rice, or off the campus, and they come from locally in Houston, and they come from across the U.S. mostly. We invite them into the studios, and we collaborate with them on the projects, and they give us advice on the projects, and the students are able to understand the kind of knowledge and the kind of knowledge transfer that happens through that kind of expertise. A person that works in a consultancy like that, I mean, this is something we have to appreciate as architects. Someone that works for like Silman Associates, who's an engineer out of New York that has done a lot of work, including like Smithsonian museums and things like that. They did Grace Farms for Sana. That engineer might work on 50 projects over the course of a year. They would work with projects with Sana. They would work with projects with David Ajay. They'd work on projects, across the profession. And they have a very different kind of knowledge than if we invite somebody, even a partner from one of those firms they work for, wouldn't work on that many projects over the course of a year, right? So there's a different kind of knowledge transfer. There's a different kind of expertise that's flowing through our discipline, and we need to be smarter as architects in how we engage all kinds of expertise, not just technical expertise, but other kinds of expertise in the social sciences and other domains. But in this case, we started from the assumption that we were teaching how to deal with building science techniques.
There's a project that Troy's methodology reminds me of that I think it's relatable to a project in Ukraine that the Russian audience might be familiar with by Kuba Snopek. The project is called Stage. And it's a really interesting project. So basically the reason that I think the methodology that Troy's talking about in Stage is similar is that Stage, a lot of people say, is the first fully crowdsourced, crowd-designed building. And if you look at the people that were involved with the project, it's an entire entree of every single different building science specialist, social scientists. Yeah, just like the diversity of the types of people that were included in the project was fascinating. And so I guess my question is, in the project, the reason that I'm bringing up Stage is that so the so-called architect of the project was separated from the building designer. So the architect was actually choreographing the building designer, the people that were doing acoustics, the people that were in theater. So basically, my question for you, Troy, is that do you think that with what you're talking about, do you think that the architect and the building designer are becoming two different things? Like, is there a schism that's happening between the building designer and the architect? And if so, what is the architect's role in this new paradigm?
Well, I guess I should be clear. I'm not super familiar with the project you're describing, but I understand it from your description pretty well, I think. To be clear, I guess I do think that there is still a role for a kind of author embedded in the practice of architecture. So I'm not about erasing the hand or the presence of an architect. What I'm trying to do is actually reformulate or ask the question of what is it to be an author in 2020? And I think there's a different set of skills, and there is a need for design leadership. I think architects need to be design leaders. So it's not a project of erasure, but a project of engagement. I think an architect needs to be an engaged leader. And I often use the word nimble when I describe what an architect needs to be. An architect needs to be nimble enough to engage many, many, many audiences and many different collaborators, both in the design phase, but also in the imagination of the building as an object that's going to operate in our society. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm sure we'll get to some more totalization stuff on the Q&A part of this, but I want to talk about a couple of other zones. One is the COVID kind of experience, and I'm curious if you could just kind of like really briefly tell me about what your experience has been, I guess, in this, like from like your perspective, but then what do you sense is going to stay or change or be permanent about what happened last semester?
Well, I think what's interesting in thinking about education and having a series like this that looks at this, I think, is very smart in this moment, because again, in a moment when so many things that we understand as the foundation of architectural education, as the kind of form of architectural education as it's delivered, were kind of swept away suddenly, and we're now asked to put it back together and asked what is essential about what we actually put back. I think it's making us ask a lot of big questions about the nature of an education. So, one of those things has been the design studio, and what are the modes of learning that actually happen in a design studio. We were talking about this a little bit right before we got on the public call. But it seems like what we found is that delivering content as a university experience, or delivering content as an architectural design school experience, is actually relatively easy online. Most of the content, if we think about just information. I mean, these systems that we're on now, as we're able to like, reach around the world and have a conversation like this, are designed to deliver a certain kind of content. What's very hard to replicate in an architecture school, and at least in the context of Rice and what I understand the American architecture school to be, is there's an intense social component to architecture school that's not contained in the content. Students pretty much make the studios like their domestic space. They eat in their studios, they cook in their studios, they fall in love in their studios. Like studios are the place where they live their lives. And now we can ask for good or bad. I mean, we've asked that question and tried. That before, but now we're really focused on it. And so how do the students actually seem to get enough of us in terms of content delivery and enough interaction with us. What it's very hard to simulate is, or not simulate, but create, is kind of meaningful connection between our colleagues that are going through the same issues and looking at the same projects. So that's been the focus of some of our brainstorming and planning for the fall, is how do you build a student social project that somehow matches what you expect in a studio. And even if we can be partially on in person, which is what my university is talking about now, and a lot of universities are looking at, what is a studio environment if everyone is wearing a mask and has to stay 8 feet away from each other? It's very different from what we imagined as our studio environment.
There's also like just a verb of the school. They're the people the next studio over, and how those students are, you kind of like randomly drop in on other people's work.
Lectures, events like this. I mean, it's so great to reach out like this, but I mean, it would be a very different thing if, Alex and Anna and all of us had met in person and had met some students in person, if we were actually, at the school, than having events like this online. The kind of more informal questions or interactions or conversations that you could have from guests. All that's part of the social culture of the school, exhibitions. Yeah.
Or is it going to drift back more or less to normal once people get comfortable, or are there things that are going to permanently change? That's what I'm asking.
What we hear mostly from our students and mostly from our faculty colleagues is that for the most part, everyone hates this condition
right.
As a mode of learning. So there's a lot of pressure to get back to what everyone considered to be the normal. That said, as much as they hate not having some of the things they had before, I think people are getting very good at manipulating a lot of the technology that we have now, and getting very good at doing what we call asynchronous education, or education that doesn't rely on everyone being in the same place at the same time, or just dislocated education where you don't actually have to be in the same place. Either one of those scenarios, I think people are getting much better at. So these certain kinds of functions that are frankly quite easy to do asynchronously. For instance, teaching first year, we talked about this first year education, just delivering an assignment as a set of instructions doesn't necessarily need to take place synchronously. It could take place in an asynchronous way, but maybe the conversations you have around the implications of that assignment need to take place in a different, in an in-person format, So I don't know, those are small things, but also I've been on some reviews. We have events like this. We're able to also just pull on a much broader set of resources across universities that we would normally rely, because the expectation is you would actually travel there. We'd rely on people flying in to do events. But I think we'll see a lot more of these kind of events where if we want to have a panel, we can very easily invite from other universities. Even if the budgets are not there, it's going to be leveling in that way in terms of how we can communicate. It typically was the wealthier universities that could afford to fly people in. But I think there's going to be a leveling in that regard as well.
One of the other things that's a little bit equally anxiety invoking as the first year architecture student is the first year professional leaving architecture school. and trying to get in practice and take those first steps in practice when maybe you're hired virtually, you will start working virtually, go into the office, can't get mentorship. How are you thinking about that? Like, I know it's a little bit maybe outside of your responsibility, but great teachers try to, see those.
Well, I will report. Yeah, I will report on what's going on a little more broadly. I've never had as many meetings amongst faculty from my institution or between institutions as I've had in the last 2 months. There's a lot of work that faculties are doing on all these questions, which I think is there's a lot of labor involved, also very refreshing in a way. So I'm on a committee that has been looking at this for the Architectural League of New York and trying to construct a kind of mentoring framework for just this population. All of us are watching our students graduate in an environment that I don't know how different it is in Moscow, but in the US, there's literally 0 jobs in the environment right now for in the country right now for graduating professionals. And so how can we help create some continuity in that and some sort of camaraderie and some sort of support that doesn't exploit that labor, but lets them to maintain their skills and grow connections. And so it's a big problem because those first few years out of a graduate or undergraduate education really shape how you are able to interact with the profession for the rest of your career. So we want to do what we can. So I won't say any more because it's really the Arc League's position to say it publicly, but there'll be more coming from that.
But there are, you're not going to tell us any of the good ideas, but you feel like there are good ideas like coming out. There are things that there are.
I don't know if they're good ideas, and it's a really bad situation, as we know everywhere. None of these are great ideas, like they're going to solve the problem. But there's a lot of concerned people trying to figure out how to do what they can. Yeah, and organizations trying to figure out how to do what they can, and and also ask how to do what they can in the short term to solve the short-term problem, which is we train students for one environment and they're graduating into another, which is very disheartening thing to see as a professor. But also how to rethink the training that we're doing to graduate students into an environment that matches, or how to train students to the environment that they're faced with right now, which is not going to go away, I think, in the next 6 months. It's going to go away in several years, maybe. And I would say also more broadly, I would zoom out, what we're seeing with the COVID crisis and the pressure that we're seeing on universities. And I teach at a very wealthy private university, but we're seeing this pressure across the universities in different ways. We're seeing how problems in our system are that we know are there, that we've been trying to confront, are actually just showing massive cracks now, and certain things are falling apart in ways that we haven't seen before. And so I think it is a moment to rethink that model of education.
What's a type of university that's going to be really hammered by this?
Well, in the US context,
you have friends who are faculty at universities who are terrified.
Well, in the US context, I mean, I'm not sure, if any of the Russian students are thinking about coming to graduate school in the US or something like that, they might see this. But in the US context, universities are highly revenue driven by tuition, and different schools depend on that tuition revenue in different degrees. So schools, the more quote unquote revenue driven the school is, and that can be even public institutions. Many public institutions rely very little on their public support and quite a lot on their tuition from students, even students coming from abroad.
Or especially
some of them do. And so that revenue is going away. It's getting more expensive to teach a school because you have to have all these interventions because of COVID. And so that's putting a lot of pressure on budgets. Yeah, but that's the thing. I mean, I'd be curious. I mean, this is a very maybe Daniel has insight into this. This is a very American perspective in terms of the panel setup, but I don't know if my colleagues in Germany or some of my foreign colleagues from abroad see the same kind of pressure from schools that have more government funding. But in the U.S., the government funding is not really there, so they're under a lot of strain. So these great universities that have been built up over generations are seeing the kind of once in a generation pressures on their ability to exist. I think we're going to lose some universities in this as well.
You think some will? You think some will collapse because of this? That have been nervous, huh?
Mm-hmm. It could be without some serious intervention. Yes. Yeah.
Do you think that's a good thing? In certain respects, because what you were saying earlier, that these universities were kind of on a down, or they were sort of being undermined for some period. You think that like there was need to change certain aspects of the university that's going to just be triggered now?
I think there's a need to have a reckoning about how we fund education, and so that's definitely there. I wouldn't celebrate any institutions that are breaking up, like a university. I mean, that's
bad thing short term, good thing long term, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, but anyway, there's a lot of I think there's going to be a lot of pressure from that. So we're seeing that in our university too, to some degree.
Okay, if this wasn't already enough complexity, now you've got the Black Lives Matter stuff. That is, I think, in my opinion, it seems to like present more of a possibility to change a school like Rice than the COVID element. Do you think that's true?
I don't know if there's something unique about a school like Rice in either situation. I'm not sure how much the questions that you're of structural racism and the kind of history of structural racism that you're referring to in Black Lives is of interest to our international audience, but I'll try to like articulate it a little bit in the sense that there is probably you've seen in the news coming out of the US. There's a long history, and many people outside of the US know this history better than Americans know it ourselves, of genocide and structural racism in the US that a lot of the American wealth is built on. And so I think we're seeing a reckoning right now, a conversation around reckoning because of some of the very public deaths that have circulated in the media, horrific deaths, and a conversation around that. Those conversations are happening in every institution, every department, every faculty, probably every business is having those conversations. And at Rice, we're trying to figure out how those can be a catalyst to change some of our teaching practices. Yeah.
So there are conversations.
I don't know if it particularly affects Rice. I don't know that I'm trying to figure out how it particularly affects Rice. Rice also has a history that's implicated as an institution that's implicated by was founded on a racist charter, and so it has that particular history.
But for example, okay, COVID is the thing that people are having conversations about how this is going to change education. In terms of the social justice issues around Black Lives Matter, I was a co-signer and sort of one of the originators of a long letter issuing a list of demands to the university, talking about not just like minor changes, like structural changes to how the student body is made up, how the faculty is made up. That seems to me to be more relevant long-term than, whether or not we're doing Zoom studios, like the chemistry of the school and how and the curriculum. So what was your reaction reading those, and were you a participant in any of the ones to the other institutions that you were trained at or educated at?
What's my reaction to the specific letters that Rice University received around recently.
Yeah,
from the
so like the kind of
75.
social justice reforms.
Mm. I mean, my reaction to recent, I mean, this is something that Rice is already working on before we got the letters. So what's remarkable is like most of the things on the letters are things we have on our own internal lists and that we're already working on. So point by point, the reaction was, you know, the letters are welcome. I mean, the thinking around the problem is welcome. Many of the things that are listed on the letters are very easy things for an institution to do. Many of the things in the letters are things the institution's already doing that maybe it's not being clear enough about the outcomes and what it's doing in relation to those. What my reaction to letters in general is there's several set of my reaction to letters in general. There's several set of things that we've confronted recently. I think this is one of the most horrific ones, or has to be the most horrific, the like legacy of structural racism in the US. There's other issues in relation to sexism in the profession, issues in relation to problems of capitalism and the way in which power flows through capital, that we need to do better at addressing. And we can do a lot of the things that are listed in those letters and not really get at the core of why those are more like symptoms, like not get at the core of like the problems of why these things are happening in our system of architectural education. And so my reaction really is, and I said as much in my direct response to those letters, what I'm interested in is trying to figure out how we can change the structure of what we do so that these symptomatic things that are being brought up in the letters actually get taken care of as a matter of course, as a matter of the production of the system, and that we don't have a system that's producing these inequalities and reproducing these inequalities in such a way that we are constantly doing this constantly imagining we have to do like small scale maintenance to ameliorate the effects of the system. So that's my general reaction. And so most of the work I think the faculty is doing in the conversations that I've had and that faculties need to do, and you see some of this in different responses from different schools. Why is it that we have a profession that takes 8 years to get an education, 3 years of apprenticeship, and 10 exams in order to call yourself an architect in the US? I mean, that's crazy. Why is it that we have a system based on a certain mode of like studio education? There's certain structural questions that I think need to be addressed that go beyond just many of the issues which are kind of easy, frankly, to deal with, and many of the issues from the letters would be easy to take on. And I think we have a unique faculty to have even more insight into how the structures are actually produced that are producing these inequalities. Yeah. So that's my reaction. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to sum up, but that's what has to happen. Yeah.
One of the most interesting proposals I've seen to address these systemic issues came from a professor at Princeton, Mitch McEwen. And I think this ties back to totalization in the sense that it's reframing what the architect does. Professor McEwen suggested ending architectural licensure. And in her, it was in a tweet, but she basically said that architecture licensure and how incredibly difficult it is to get an architectural license. You study for so long, you take all these exams, and what it ultimately does is licensure as a system, it delegitimizes skilled labor. There's a lot of other people that could be assuming the roles that only someone with an architectural license is legally allowed to do. So just, yeah, I just, it was the first time I had ever heard of such a such a straightforward proposal that could have such a sort of tangential butterfly effect that could make the profession much more accessible. I thought it was a really interesting idea.
I think it's a great idea. I mean, I think it's a great idea for other reasons, but I mean, I think the way in which licensure around architecture is practiced in the US is mostly maintains the status quo, which means people that have it and have had it for a long time benefit the most from it. And the benefit's not that great, but they still benefit inequitably. And it makes the bar of entry quite high. And anytime you have the bar of entry into any profession set so high, you're going to have, it's going to be administered, and I've seen it, it's going to be administered, in my experience, inequitably. So yeah, I think we examine that. And those are the kind of structures I think we need to be able to take on, both when it comes to who's entering the pipeline out of school, when who's entering the pipeline of education before they get to us as well.
I think it's fascinating to think about how, if architectural licensure in the US were to be ended, how that would affect academia. If students are no longer sort of prepared to, they're no longer taught to go to work for the market, the free market. They're no longer sort of being molded to be agents of the market, but rather, like, what if architectural licensure is ended? How would that affect how architecture students are trained, what they're being? I imagine that if something like that were to happen, students would have more education in the social sciences and the political sciences. That I imagine that architects would become much more like political actors rather than sort of agents of the market, if that makes any sense.
I don't know. It's hard to predict. I wouldn't assign so much like agency to populations like students. I think what it would give individual students more options, and we would probably see a whole set of very different outcomes that would happen with very different student populations. But it would give more people access to seats at the table. It would also give more people more variation in how they could educate themselves to be designers, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if we would completely do away with a license, or if it would be a license that would come from a certain kind of education. I mean, in Europe, you get a license when you graduate from the university you're at. You don't have to take a 3-year internship and an exam and all that stuff. So, you know, there might be a different way in which we construct licensure that's just much more accessible to more people, and creates a much more variety of paths to licensure and much more variety of paths after you carry that license.
Do you think it's realistic?
Because you haven't invested so much in the first place.
Do you think it's realistic? Do you imagine this could happen?
Well, what I'm hoping is coming out of some of the activism we're seeing, and the reason we're talking about licensure, which is not the university, which is maybe something you want to talk about, and I don't want to take the focus off of what we're doing at the university, but I think it's realistic if the same kind of energy that's being put into thinking about how we restructure something like university education is put into other aspects of our profession, how we restructure our relationship to organizations like the American Institute of Architects or NCARB or other institutions that are shaping. One thing, this is not to defend universities in our role in this, but one thing I see quite often is actually universities compared to the profession are in some ways more egalitarian. And when students go through the experience of the university and the openness of the university and the kind of exchange they have in the university, and they're confronted with the pressures of the world outside on the other side of their education, there's a kind of stark difference. And some figuring out how to basically reshape both the profession and the university, I think it has to be part of the conversation as well.
Yeah.
Well, to kind of tie it together, Dan had a good point that there's a little bit of there's something natural about the totalization ethos that seems to look at these different things, these different external forces, societal forces, and make them part of the conversation. You know, I don't want to do it in like a sloppy way per se.
No,
But
I don't think it has to be sloppy, but I think if you zoom out, I think we could say one thing we have to be open to, and when we look at certain models of history, certain models from history are very invested in building up the notion of what constitutes architect and what constitutes the practice of an architect is a very singular thing. There's a very singular idea around that, around who that person is that is the architect, around how that person behaves in the world, and around how that person, how the buildings that person makes, or the kind of things that person makes in places in the world, how they operate in the world. And I think this is not, this is one small effort to destabilize that that narrow path to being an architect as those models. So to say that there's, you know, the idea that an architectural education could be something that models some the kind of non-linearity of a spreadsheet, or non-centrality of a spreadsheet as something that's built up, or an accumulation of very different kinds of knowledge that go into a kind of a practice, rather than a kind of path through very specific types of expertise, I think is something that would be a model to build on or think about as we think about our architectural education, because especially in a model, if there's a license or no license, but in a model where the modes of architects and architectural practice become more diverse, I think the types of training that we're going to need are going to have to be more diverse.
I think that we're ready to get some questions from the audience. By far, we received a comment, which is, I think, very true and also worth discussing. The comment states that the path to licensure is indirectly limited by already licensed professionals. So it's a kind of top-down system which prevents architectural education and the professional field of architecture from changing. And I guess that's what most of very different protests, not only ones that we have now, but also in, I don't know, 1968, for example, were about. Young people who are not only young, but young people are maybe most kind of affected by it, trying to change the situation from the bottom, right? To address the rigidness of the system. And I would maybe ask for your thoughts. How do you think it works in a studio? Because that's where these two kind of words, or in the school in general, or in studio, that's where these two words are collided: licensed professionals, established professionals, masters, and someone who is in a position to question their authority and the system in general.
Mm-hmm.
How do we invite it, or how do we deal with this when it happens? What do you think?
How do we invite more voices into studio? Is that sort of what the question is, or how do we rethink about studio?
Yeah. Well, it's a complex station, because there is a possibility of course, lots of discomfort and kind of destabilizing the process of education, the process of delivering of the programs, and so on. But at the same time, we kind of all want to be pluralistic, democratizing, and so on. How do we balance these two things?
Yeah, I sometimes wonder if one of the ways to come at some of these questions is to actually draw slightly more narrow boundaries around what it is architects are capable of doing and should focus on learning how to do. not so much to say how the role of a whole community could be implicated, in social change, but to just say architects tend to have very big egos and to be a little bit narcissistic as a profession. And we tend to think that we can, through like a studio or an architectural education, take on like we create whole new worlds, and we can take on like all the work of world building inside of our studios and inside of our discipline. And I think I sometimes think through the discussions we've been having that if we focused a little bit more on what architects do, which is, to I think Daniel's point earlier, if we focused on things like building, questions around building, and implications around questions around building, that it would limit the conversation in a way, but maybe not limit the implications of that conversation, if that makes any sense. And you could actually use the medium of building as a space of transaction in a way that sometimes when architects try to operate more like they are completely social scientists, or they are completely operating in the world of historians, or they're completely operating in the world of another discipline, that they that it's harder to have a kind of maybe a conversation around what the discipline's actually capable of achieving, especially once you get out of school. And so that's not to limit what's possible, but to maybe focus the conversation in a way that we could actually focus on maybe what are some plausible ways we could restructure the building trades, we could restructure the practice of building, the practice of how building is financed, the practice of how we design neighborhoods, the practice of how we fund the production of public space in those neighborhoods. The practice of all of those things have very broad social implications, but they're also very grounded in how we understand the expertise inside our discipline. I don't know if that's a way to do it. I think especially in the US context, there's so much focus on, I would say, discursive structures around architecture that some of these, let's call them the practice of building questions that are at the core of the discipline aren't seen to have the same kind of agency. But I actually think in some ways what we're seeing, when you look at the history, and you look at the history of redlining, you look at the history of how mortgages are financed in the US, or how public housing is funded, and then how that translates into like whether or not they're built out of concrete or steel, or how that steel is deployed, where that concrete came from. Those kind of questions of materialist questions around how we build actually are at the core of a lot of these other issues. And so figuring out how we fit into a group of expertise, I think that's part of what totalization is after, is to say we don't have to contain all the answers as an individual architect. We have to understand where our realm begins and ends, and how do we create partnerships with those other disciplines that I'm describing, so we can build more equitable housing, we can build more infrastructure that helps cities thrive, so we can do the kinds of things that I think we all want to do in our practices, but we feel frustrated about the current systems that are set up around them.
Alexander, one of the anxieties I think Troy felt throughout this conversation was that none of this is translating cleanly over to the Russian context. What do you think? Do these conversations translate?
Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting question. I just wanted to mention that we're not kind of not seeing this series of talks as specifically oriented towards Russian audience. It's of course our audience, and but it doesn't mean that. But March is a relatively new school, Moscow Architecture School. It's just 8 years old, and we trying to question everything that comes from Russia in terms of architectural education, but also from abroad. Our academic partner, London Metropolitan University, School of Architecture and Arts in London Metropolitan University, is where we take in our basis of the system of architectural education, And we're trying to be critical about that as well. So it's not that we're seeing ourselves only within the Russian context. But I'd like to say what is very important in your question is that political and social debates for decades in Soviet Union and Russia were not public, and through that they were limited to basically ethical questions and very general questions. And they were not reaching the professional apparatus. The architectural agenda was kind of free of this. This is what we trying to change within our school through studio briefs or discussions like this one. But it's not easy. And Daniel, I think, could also comment on this, spending some time in Russia within the Russian program. So this is not easy to be changed. But what was, when Troy was saying that we could, that being limited to kind of purely architectural questions, it's sometimes a good way of dealing with the complexity of the real world. That's what we had for many years, I would say.
I see.
Yeah, let's stick to architecture, let's stick to building design and that sort of things. Coming out of this circle of questions is not easy, of course, but yeah, that's what we're also interested in. How do you bring it inside the school? How do you make it a part of conversation? But that's not easy.
Yeah, just to build off of that, I think that, yeah, having spent time studying architecture in the US and in Russia, I think that the US can learn a lot from the proliferation of new schools of architecture and design that are opening up in Russia, in Ukraine. I'm specifically talking about Marsh, I'm talking about Strelka, I'm talking about the Kharkov School of Architecture in Ukraine, because it seems to me that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a stasis period in which the only option for studying architecture was to go to the existing state-run system. And around 2010, you started to see new schools like Strelka, like Marsh opening up, younger practitioners and academics that were questioning what it means to study architecture altogether. And they felt that the only way to reinvent it was to create new institutions rather than reform the existing ones, like the existing schools of architecture that had been in existence for almost 100 years. And I guess in the US, it's interesting to maybe the only comparison would be something like SciArc. That's sort of, it's purely a school of architecture. It's pretty independent from the university system. But I'm interested in, yeah, I think that the US can learn a lot from Russia when it comes to, rather than reforming institutions, but creating new ones entirely. And I think that it's a liberational sort of approach. And I think there's a lot of potential for that kind of thinking in the US.
Since that, Troy, do you think that we could, if there's opportunities for opening like new programs that don't have a lot of the baggage of the kind of current structure?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, I think we have seen.
Yes. Do I just not know about them, or am I not? Am I kind of?
No. I think there is potential for that, and I think we've seen that through history in moments when the current framework seemed like it was satisfying or be up to the problems of the moment. You know, programs like CalArts or SciArc or Open University in Chile, or I mean, there's a whole history of these kinds of schools, Black Mountain College, that emerge at certain moments to deal with a rip or a lack of current institutions to be up to the moment. Some of those institutions last and become
Established.
Settled and stayed, established institutions in their own right, and some of them get absorbed into other institutions, and some of them, become moments. But I certainly could see that kind of thing happening now. Yeah, for sure. One of the one of the things that characterizes our moment so much, though, which is also one reason why I think working on big projects like the kind of project that is implicated in the work against anti-racism in the U.S. context, or work against problems of capitalism, is that if anything has characterized our moments, it's been a kind of splintering of interests. If you look across faculties, there's not like a single conversation really happening. It's not a kind of very stable set of conversations or communities, which means that means in the same way there's not the finding, I think, those alliances and finding those the momentum on certain kinds of projects has been difficult in the past 20 years. Whereas this moment of COVID and this moment of watching these tragedies and try to figure out the implications for universities and schools of architecture and their complicity in structural racism, I think, are moments that are starting to galvanize a collective conversation in a way that I haven't seen in my career ever. And when you have that collective conversation, then it's possible maybe to imagine building a new dominant themes of the moment, or they're an extension of them in a way that seems obvious. I don't know how that manifests itself, but we tend to talk about the discipline as though it's and it's not monolithic, actually.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about new schools, and I guess it was a little bit like this in the US in 1960s when the system of the Covey Bazaar schools collapsed. I think what's interesting about the new schools is that it's sometimes easy to establish a new school if you clearly have a notion of what you don't want to do, why old is bad. And that's what we touched a little bit in our first conversation between the Dean of Moscow Architecture School and the Dean of Architectural Institute in Prague, also established in 2010s, so both very new schools. So I think what I wanted to say that to be new is sometimes easy. What I very interested in the US context is that these large established institutions also are having the way of reinventing or reestablishing something without being kind of destroyed by it, with a continuation. And we've seen that in, for example, also in the 1970s, for example, in Princeton or in Austin or in other places, right? When new people arriving, sometimes or very often from Europe, were kind of changing the direction of schools. So I think it's also interesting and also maybe more complex, but also involves more kind of professional questions when you have to balance old programs and things like licensing or certification of programs with something new. It is a tension that could be also very creative resource. What do you think? The balancing of old and new.
Yeah.
In one institution.
I think that, yeah, you're thinking that'd be some example of Media Lab or something, like a kind of, which has its own problems recently, but which is a kind of institution that emerges inside of another institution, or a new institution that emerges inside of another institution. I think looking at those kind of hybrid models is something that is going to sense the future as well. I mean, one of the things that's overarching this, again, in the American context, and I'm not sure how this but I think it probably does, is because of the certain inequities in global capital that we're seeing in the world, and how those inequities have found their ways into college education. And in college education in America, I mean, it costs $40,000 $1,000 a year in tuition at some of these schools. There's so much pressure on our student body to perform in a certain way, to justify justify their place in these institutions, to justify the expense that's being spent on, they feel like is being spent on them, parents or their future. That it's also that pressure, how a student body performs, I think, is another pressure on the institution that gives it a certain character and gives it a certain set of questions that it's allowed to ask and certain kinds of mandate that it's allowed to operate within. And so I think if there was a way to clearly, this generation, is engaged socially, is like ready to like take on some problems that they've inherited, that they're now trying to figure out how to like create a world that undoes. Clearly they're ready for the conversation, but they're not given the kind of space either within institutions or alongside institutions or in new institutions to work that out for themselves. And the kind of money and pressure and competition that these institutions like I'm at represent, make them very difficult places for that to happen. Maybe is something I've been thinking about in this moment as well. And so yeah, thinking about creating space for that kind of thing, formally or informally, that can leverage the resources that have been built up over, and the real resources, and you see them if you move across institutions, the real resources that some of these institutions have built up. That's why, when David asked me, would I be sad to see them go away? I mean, yeah, I would be sad to see them go away, for also all of the resources that they represent, all of the people that have worked for them over a long period of time to make them something that in their best cases can offer possibilities for us as a future. But are they able to function in their current way that seems to be able to respond to the challenges of the day? I mean, not all of them. And so I think it would be some kind of balance in the way you're describing. So, I mean, that would be something we'd have to figure out for sure. And that's something that, you think of an institution as being something. When we say institutions, we talk about institutions as though there's like a special cadre of people that control an institution, that have been there forever, that know how the institutions are us, and so even in my role now, there's a moment when you arrive at a moment in a professorship where you start to have some voice in how the institution is organized, and that's just figuring out the mechanisms of that and how institutions can change. I mean, they will change, and they are changing. They're made up of the people that produce them and continue to maintain them. Yeah, and so that hopefully, what we're trying to do is make it so that there's a bigger set of voices that can shape them and change them, or break them apart. I mean, yeah, but I would be sad to see. I mean, when if we're talking about educational institutions in America, I'd be sad to see if University of Arizona disappears as an institution. I would be sad.
Maybe not too many institutions are around. And maybe do you have any ideas about your next studio? How you would change it in reaction to what's going on?
Well, what we're able to do now and what we're thinking about in the fall is how we can do kind of what we've been able to do today. Again, we were limited by money before, and we had some money, so we were able to fly people in to do different kinds of work. And that seemed to be how business was being done then, and how our studios would be done. Now that everyone, including the experts that we use, and our students and our faculty, are more engaged in these kinds of asynchronous educational moments, it seems like we could bring in even more voices and a more diverse array of folks from different aspects of the industry and different aspects of the of academia, frankly, into the studio space, instead of the studios being more like insular black boxes that produce certain kinds of renderings and certain kind of models at the end of every semester. We could have a bigger conversation within the studios, because we have the resource and people have the willingness to kind of travel through these kind of portals like we have.
And David and Daniel, I don't know if you are going to teach next year. But anyway, if you are, or if you can think about it, how would you change? What would you change in the process of teaching, or in this format of studio?
This is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. When I was an undergrad studying architecture, the first time I had taken a course where I was really focused around current events and political science, I had to take a graduate level planning class. And in this class, the idea was to have architects really thinking about current events, and rather than thinking about these sort of broad conceptual spherical issues, we were asking questions like, for instance, when I was in school, the White House had just added a second perimeter fence around its border. And we had to write an essay. What do you think about that? Such a different kind of question to be asked in architecture school, because usually you're thinking about Deleuze, you're thinking about all of these far out things, but then now it's so much different. It's such a different question to be asked to be thinking about a wall. What do you think about a wall around like the Capitol building? And it changed the way I think about architecture, and it's something that right now I'm very interested in bringing current events, like a class like a current events or a political science, making that part of the curriculum and in American architecture schools, because I think that it will fundamentally change the projects that the students create. It will change the way that students think about their role it will contextualize architecture. Students, I think, will be more conscious about what it means to build in cities, their roles as agents of gentrification, whether or not they want to contribute to that or don't want to contribute to that. I think confronting students with these questions very early on is very important. So I guess to answer your question, I don't have any particular, there are some projects that I'm working on where that could lead to a teaching role, but as my career sort of goes on and I get more involved with academia, I'm very interested in bringing current events classes into architecture school.
Yeah, I don't plan on teaching next semester, but if I did, I would say that the typology that I've been working on a lot lately is the office space, and there were a lot of pre-COVID. There was a lot of pre-COVID pressure building for changing the nature of like open office spaces, for example, and a lot of companies were looking at that. Now there's like a huge market-based demand for it, and there's a tremendous anxiety on the side of companies that hold, that own huge portfolio of office lease space, that they're completely losing their minds trying to figure out what to do. And so I love the opportunity of something to try to add some value to that conversation. And it's like my favorite kind of project in some ways, because something in the office is very mundane, and that if you can bring some more fundamental thinking to it, like all kinds of interesting things emerge really fast.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I guess we'll have to finish the conversation. And in the end, I just wanted to make one comment to connect some of the topics that we discussed with the general idea of deschooling, which is used in the title of our series of talks. I was just thinking that the inventor of this term and the idea of deschooling, Ivan Illich, could be very interested in the part of our conversation, which was dealing with the problem of licensing and professional structure, because that's what he also thought to be a real kind of problem, and the way the structural inequality of society is kind of transformed in professional and educational structures through things like certification, licensing, curricula, and that sort of things. I think the the moment that we live in through with all these online things and conversations like that really gives some opportunity to restructure things, maybe. And for my school in particular, it of course is a very complex situation because we just kind of recently acquired this system, right? We just recently started using it in Russia, and it's a point of our kind of foundational thing for March, for the Moscow Teacher School. And now but maybe it's also easy for us, might be easier for us to rethink it as well. Thank you.
I hope we can figure out how to invite you all back to Houston somehow. Now that we know we can connect, we can have a similar conversation in Houston maybe and turn the tables and learn a little bit about more about what's going on in March and you know, I think as I was thinking about translating all of this conversation, you know, across the continent to a different audience, I'd be really curious to learn and to have information maybe flow a different direction from you all as well. Because anyway, it seems like your project here with March program, and then even how it's being shaped by these conversations and the work going on in Moscow. It's really interesting what you guys have going on here, and I'd love to figure out how to learn more about it. So maybe you can join us in Houston in some way now that we know how we can communicate in this format. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, it would be great. We had some experience with joint studios with students from Russia and Switzerland, for example, and Russia and the United States from Columbia University. And it always implied a lot of traveling. Now it might be easier to do this. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you all the listeners and viewers, and of course thanks to Troy, Daniel, and David for joining us in this conversation today. I also would like to thank our interpreter Alexander Baich for his contribution. Our next meeting will be very soon on Tuesday. It will be featuring Professors Anna Miyaki from MIT and Sarah Kirschman from University of California, Berkeley. And we'll see how their conversation, what would be their take on the same topics. Follow our announcements in social networks and on the program website. Thank you very much, and well, see you soon.
Thanks,
Bye.
Alexander.
Thank you so much. Thank you.